In the last section, we spoke about the reason that we destructure objects, and specifically destructure out of argument objects. So I kind of made the case that it's very handy to pass in objects as arguments as opposed to like a long list of strings. In this section, we're going to tackle a very similar topic, so why we're using destructuring, but we're going to talk about it in the kind of the viewpoint of why we'd use destructuring off of arrays. So what is a practical use case of destructuring an array beyond the incredibly obvious, please give me the first element out of the array? So I actually do have a pretty darn good example of where I personally made use of array destructuring. So this is an example from an app from a project that I actually was working on myself. I was working with an API that would produce data to put onto a chart as a series of X and Y coordinates. So in other words, I had a kind of data structure that would look like something like this. It was an array that contained a list of points, 4 and 5, and maybe 10 and 1, 0 and 40 or something like that. And so these points were the X and the Y values. And this was exactly how it came back to me from the API. So you could kind of imagine that I could produce, at the end of the day, I could probably produce a chart based on this series of numbers here. So the problem that I encountered with this was that the graphing library that I wanted to use did not want to see an array of arrays to see its data. Instead, it wanted to see a data structure that looked a little bit more like this, an array of objects that contained an X property and a Y property. So the X being the location on the X-axis and the Y being the location on the Y-axis. So I would also have 0 and Y of 40. So I needed to somehow take the data that was being served to me from this API as an array of arrays and turn it into this list of objects that had a X and a Y property. Okay, so that was the goal. That's what I was up against. To really break this down to what we're trying to do here, what we're really trying to do here is transform our data in some fashion. Like we've got the hard-coded data, right? Like the actual numbers. I don't want to touch the actual numbers. I want to change the structure of this object. That's what I really want to do here. So let's figure out how we would approach this using some ES6 code. Now I've got absolutely no doubt in my mind that you could figure out a way to do this with a for loop, right? I'm sure when you see this problem right here, you might think to yourself, oh yeah, a for loop, we can iterate over it, and then for every array in here, we'll just push it into an object, like no problem. Well, yeah, we could do that, but that's not, it's not super fun, right? Let's figure out how to do this with nothing but ES6 code. So the approach that we're going to take is we are going to map over this array. For every element in the array, which is a pair of points, we are going to destructure off an X and Y value, and then we are going to use the improved object literal syntax to return an object with X and Y properties. All right, so I know with words it probably doesn't make that much sense, so let's see what it looks like with code. So first off, I want to map over the list of all these points. So I'll use my map helper, points.map, and for every group of points, I'm going to take in a pair. And so notice that I'm kind of breaking off from that convention of going with plural and singular, but that's just because points I would refer to as this list of points right here, but each individual kind of point object actually contains 2 points within itself. So I'm going to deviate from that approach just a little bit here, just to keep everything a little bit more clear. So out of every pair, I have an X value and a Y value, and I need to somehow capture those. Now I could do something like, const X equals pair.x and const Y equals pair.y, but this is definitely going into the realm, or excuse me, I don't want the .x and .y, I want 1 and 0. And so what we've got right here would be a perfect candidate for some array destructuring. So I could add in some square braces, like so, to pull off the X and Y. And then I would destructure these off the pair object. But you might notice that I'm just pulling in this pair object right here and then immediately pulling these properties off. I can destructure array objects in the argument list just as we did earlier with an object as well. So rather than doing the destructuring on a new line here, I will do the destructuring in the argument list instead. So I'll pull off an X and a Y, like so. So now my arguments to this function are the x and y value, or what I'm kind of referring to them as x and y. So now out of here, I can return my object that was the whole point of this. I wanted to turn it into an object that had an x point and a y point. And so x would be x and y would be y. And now you can see that I'm definitely getting into the right area. I've got an array of objects with an x of 4 and a y of 5 and so on. One last thing to take note of here, I have a key and a value that are identical on both sides. And that's where I can start making use of the improved object literal syntax. So rather than doing xx and yy, I can reduce it down to just x and y, and boom, we end up with the same thing at the end of the day. All right, so not too bad. Definitely, looking at this initially, definitely pretty hard to figure out what's going on. I will not disagree with that, but I would argue that this is probably a little bit more legible than the implementation with a for loop, what that might look like. Again, this was a very real use case that I had to do this. I actually did write some code that looked exactly like this to kind of finagle with the data structure that came back from that API. Okay, so we've gone through a couple different examples of destructuring. Again, destructuring is a huge topic just because there's so many different places to make use of it inside of ES6. So let's take a couple minutes in the next section and walk through a couple of exercises.